Hey YouTube, you are about to watch a message from one of our weekend experiences at Tethered. The weekend experience is a 100% digital event with 100% real people in the chats ready to talk to you, to connect with you, to pray with you. There's also other elements besides just this message, but we want to make this message of hope and truth available to you to help you in your walk with Jesus. If you want to learn more about how to attend one of those weekend experiences, more about who Tethered is, what our mission is, where we're going, and other resources and ways to connect with us, you can find all of that at tethered.online. But for now, we hope you enjoy this message.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Tethered. My name's Darian, and I'm super excited to be with you this week, bringing you your weekend experience lesson. Over the past 4 parts of this 5-part series, we've been talking about how to reach your full potential and be someone great in the next 5 years. Today, though, we're going to be talking about failure. And why is it me talking about failure? Well, that's because, surprise, I've failed, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my experiences, but also how we can use failure to shape who we are. All right, so let's put it into perspective. What am I talking about when I talk about failure? First, maybe it's failure to meet our goals. And Peyton's done a great job of outlining over the past few weeks in this part of the series, what are some ways to set goals and how to accomplish things. However, maybe we've set a goal in our life. Maybe we've set a really good goal. It's a weight loss goal or a diet goal, and we slip up. We step on the scale and we've actually gained weight. We take a bite of birthday cake and think, oh man, I was supposed to give up sweets this week. And then we just jump ship. The whole goal out the window, forget about it. Or maybe there's a failure of expectations. I see this one a lot. And it's maybe expectations on myself, or maybe it's expectations on other people. Let me clarify. Expectations on myself. Maybe I set an expectation of who I'm going to be. Maybe I'm going to be a virgin when I get married, but then I have sex and I just fall into a life of promiscuity and choose that over the expectation I've held myself to. Or maybe it's an expectation on someone else. See, in my line of work and working with people, I see this is usually the core of a failed relationship. And yes, I mean marriages, but it could be a friendship, it could be a boyfriend or girlfriend, it could be your parents. But a lot of time, failure happens when you have expectations on someone else and they don't even know that that's expected of them. Or maybe they're not communicating to you what they expect of you and you're not communicating what you expect of them. Failure of expectations can also lead to the failure of a relationship. And the third way that I think about failure is failure to unlock our full potential. And again, Peyton's talked a lot about this, but we fail to sometimes make it big because we're not doing anything big. We're not taking any big risks. We fall into the mundane, everyday tasks, and we let our life follow suit. Let's take a second and reflect. Think about a time things didn't go according to plan. A time maybe you failed. How did you react? Thanks for everybody who responded in the comments in the chat. For me, failure or things not going according to plan tends to cause a lot of shame, or maybe I just shut down. I never want to talk about what I failed at ever again. And sometimes, again, that's due to shame or embarrassment. If I set a goal and I don't meet that goal, I'm never talking about that goal again. So again, thanks for responding in the comments. So like I said, if I set a goal and I don't meet it, that's on me. But there are a lot of times that failure is completely out of our hands. So let me give you the core takeaway of this lesson right here at the beginning, right up front. And here it is. We have to put something rock solid at the center of our lives, the core of our lives, so that when failure hits, we're left with something unwavering. And for me, in my experience, the only thing that is Jesus. Let's take a look into the word. Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 34. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. So let me set the scene for you. Jesus is walking through a town, and there are people everywhere. Think about when your team wins the Super Bowl, and they get to bring the ring, they get to bring the trophy back home to the city that they're from. Think about how everyone's packed in the streets, or maybe it's New York City on New Year's Eve, and we're waiting for the ball to drop, and you maybe been there, or maybe you're watching on TV and you just see a sea of people. Imagine that's what Jesus is now walking through. And the Bible says this, now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Let me tell you something about a Jewish woman in this time who was bleeding. So this woman not only was a woman, so was lower in standard or lower in social structure than men, even sometimes lower than children, or her primary function was to bear children. She was bleeding, so she not only could not reproduce and have children, which was her primary function at the time, but because of Jewish custom, men couldn't even touch her. So not only was she lower status because she was a woman, she was lower status because she couldn't bear children, and even lower status, she was unclean and untouchable by anybody. Let's keep reading. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing, for she said, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. And she did. Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. But immediately, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? His disciples said back to him, you see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, who touched me? Imagine you're downtown, New York City, waiting on the ball to drop, or you got general admission tickets to your favorite band. You're pressed in a crowd and you stop and say, who touched me, to your friends. Your friends in return would say, pretty much everyone is touching you. What are you talking about? But Jesus, on the other hand, he felt power leave his body and he said, who touched me, because of that recognition of power. But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said to you, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. This story of the bleeding woman gives us two major takeaways for how to pick up the pieces after failure. The first step is we've got to choose it. Every morning when we wake up, we make a choice. Are we going to follow after our goals and who we want to be? Or are we going to fail to do those things? The bleeding woman chose to go after Jesus, and she chose to go against everything society told her that she was. For me, in my line of work, there's a phrase that this kind of helps resonate to this story. And I work sometimes with substance abuse survivors or people who are in recovery from addiction. There's a phrase that's used, relapse is part of recovery. I remember hearing that for the first time. Okay, so you're telling me that a relapse, going back to a substance, is part of my journey to recovery. Doesn't that sound like failure? Doesn't that mean I'm 5 months clean and sober and yet I'm gonna have a relapse. Or maybe I've been sober for a long time and you're telling me because I haven't relapsed, I'm not recovered. That's not at all what the phrase means, but instead the phrase means if and when you relapse, it's just a part of your journey. And you have to choose that if you have a relapse, you're still gonna be in the process of recovery. Failure is sometimes and often part of success. So that's why I bring that phrase up. Relapse is part of recovery. Well, sometimes failure is part of our successes. The second thing we can learn from the bleeding woman is to do it. And I'm talking like the Nike slogan, just do it. This woman faced the fear that she had. For most of us, choosing to do what we've set out to do after failure is maybe harder than setting out to do it the first time. So say we set a goal, we set our mind, or we're gonna do something, but we fail. That's gonna be sometimes harder than us just deciding to do it and going after it, because we already know the sting and the pain and the hurt, or maybe the embarrassment of failing, and we're really afraid that that's gonna happen again. I don't know what your goals are for the next 5 years. Maybe you wanna go back to school and get a degree. Maybe you need to go back and get your GED. Maybe you're gonna learn Russian. Maybe you're gonna learn Chinese. Maybe you're gonna run and compete in an Ironman. Either way, you've got to plan, be inspired, you've got to choose it, and you've got to do it. However, on the flip side, 5 years from now, things could also look very different. Maybe rather than running Ironmans, you're sitting in a wheelchair. Or maybe you're not going to school, but you're caring for your sick or ailing parents or family members. Maybe you're not establishing a family, but you're struggling to start a family, or you're struggling with infertility. And that one resonates the most with me because I set up plans. I went and got my degree. I started my career. I got a master's degree. I was ready to start a family. I had all these things planned out. I was ready to start a family. Peyton was ready to start a family, and we got pregnant. And then we had a miscarriage. And I felt like my plans had crumbled around me. And although this was way up there on the list of hardest things I've ever had to go through, I was surrounded by the steadfast love of Jesus through all of it. And the bleeding woman was scared, but she also looked to Jesus. And I have a son now. It was long before I was pregnant with him that I got to experience healing, the kind of healing that only Jesus offers. I was scared to pick up and try again, and I was scared for most of my pregnancy with my son. It was an easy thing to go through, and it did change my plans. It did change my course of my life. Because of the miscarriage, my husband and I were able to foster 2 amazing boys for over a year. And I'm not telling you, I'm not here to say that Jesus causes miscarriage or God's going to cause a miscarriage so that you can be a foster parent. And I'm not saying God makes things happen so that better things can happen. I am saying that life is going to include failures, and God can work through those failures just as easily as he can work through the successes. Think back to a time you've been able to look back on a failure or something not going according to plan. Have you ever witnessed God working through your failure? So hopefully that question was easy for you to answer, but maybe it wasn't. I need you to know this though, if life doesn't go as planned, or rather when life doesn't go as planned, because it won't, I want you to be so in love with Jesus and so focused with him and rooted with him as your center that those things don't break you. That your priorities would be to seek Jesus in the crowd, to reach out, to touch the hem of his garment, and to experience the comfort and the healing that only he can provide. Knowing no matter that what happens, you can't be taken away from a relationship with him. So as we close up today, let me tell you a story that I think resonates well with what we're talking about today. This story is given originally by a man named Nicholas Bengu, and Nicholas was basically a African man who reached more Africans with the gospel than any other person in history. He told this story of a young couple. They were missionaries and they went to Africa themselves. And they wanted to be missionaries and they wanted to spread the gospel, but they were just not very good at it. So they went there, they ministered for basically their whole life, but as it was happening, they were not successful. They would preach and no one would show up to listen. They built an entire church and no one came. The mission board that was supporting them started to kind of get annoyed because they had nothing to report on. They weren't converting any people. They weren't bringing any people to Jesus. In fact, it was kind of funny that the only person that was consistently around them that they could say like, yeah, this person's here, was this little kid, but the little kid was hired to carry their bags and their stuff from place to place as they went to share their mission and share their gospel story. So after spending most of their adult life, like I mentioned, preaching and getting no response and teaching and setting up a church, their denominational headquarters finally said, guys, we've got to stop. We're using resources. It's just draining us. They're not bringing anybody. They're not converting anybody. They're no good at all. This was a huge mistake. So they called them back. And this was way back when they had to take a ship back to America. So the day they left, the day they sailed home, the only person that left to say goodbye was that little kid, and I'm pretty sure he was only there because they needed someone to carry all their stuff to get on the ship. They sailed back and they were so embarrassed. They were so humiliated. And it was only a few years later before they both passed away, absolutely convinced that they had made no difference, that they hadn't shared the gospel with anybody. What they didn't know was that that little kid was Nicholas Bengu, who's telling this story, who's now converted hundreds and thousands of people and shared the gospel. He said God didn't send them over to reach 1,000 people or 100 people or maybe even 10 people. He sent them over to reach me. And since that time, he had been able to reach even more Africans than any other man in history. These missionaries literally died thinking they were failures, but God used them. The purpose of living for Christ is not to live under the shade of a tree that you planted. The purpose of living for Christ is to plant seeds of trees, and that one day, although we understand the scorching heat, we have a promise and a future and a hope that one day the seeds we're planting will be a forest to provide shade to other people. At Tethered, we also believe that God has so much for your story. I don't think God will intend for you to die feeling like a failure, but God is going to be able to work through your failures, the small ones in your life, and even the really big ones. We're excited here at Tethered for you. We're anticipating with you to see what God is going to do with you and for you in the next 5 years. He's going to do exceedingly more than you can ever imagine because he knows the plans he has for you. And think about how he's going to work through those plans and even through the hard stuff. So here's some things to do. Write down a failure. Write down how God may have moved within that failure. right next to it on the page. So in one column, you're going to have your failures, and on the other column, you're going to have how God has worked through them, or maybe above and below, however you want to do it. But writing down a failure and writing down all the ways God may have worked through those failures is going to help you to see that failing is okay. So let me just give you an example. Maybe you were in a really long-term committed relationship, and then that relationship came to an end. You might see that as a failure. You might see that as things not going according to plan. Maybe you thought that person was the one. But maybe since then, you are able to look back and say, wow, through that, I'm able to see who God really intended for me. Or maybe you're still single and you are able to look back and see characteristics in your ex that you really couldn't have seen when you were in the relationship. And maybe that's how God's using that failure to keep you moving forward. But maybe you're also still single and God is showing you and letting you learn how to love yourself before going to love someone else. Find one failure and really evaluate how it may be okay. Failure is going to happen, but like I said, Jesus as your center is going to help you establish something trustworthy to always come back to. And that may even happen right after the failure, or it may even happen years after you've failed and you're able to look back and say, wow, God was really my center in all of that, and I'm so thankful that I had him to lean on. If you need another step to help further your relationship with God, I encourage you to join our Mark texting Bible study. We're reading through the book of Mark, and it's all over text message. All you have to do is text the word study to the number that's on the screen now. Finally, don't forget, you can still grab a free coffee on us with you and a friend, and maybe sit down and talk about your next 5 years, or talk about what you learned or took away from this week with Tethered. Just follow the link that we're going to drop in the chat right now. If you're watching this on YouTube, you should know that that link is dropped in the live chat, and so that's all the more reason for you to join our weekend experience this weekend. Tethered is a hybrid approach to following Jesus. I'll see you next week.
We hope you enjoyed this message. If you want to find others like it, just click one of these boxes here and it'll take you straight there. You also want to make sure you subscribe and hit that bell button so anytime a new message comes up, you will be notified and you can go straight there. If you want to learn more about who Tethered is and what this hybrid approach of following Jesus is all about, you need to go check out our website. Just the link to that in the description below. We recognize that people live a slipstream between online and offline, and so we want to help you in your relationship with God to find and follow him and a community offline and online. That's why Tethered exists. We hope you enjoy this video and others like it. God bless. Have a great week.